Let me ask you a question. Have you ever played an arcade game that wasn't a video game? At first, this might seem like a pretty dumb thing to ask. While not all video games are arcade games, obviously arcade games are video games, that's why they were called video arcades. But think about it for a second. What really distinguishes a video game from other kinds of game is that you don't act it out, right? What you do when you play a video game is press buttons and push control sticks around. It's the computer inside the console that translates those inputs into visible on-screen effects. In other words, a video game is entirely virtual. None of what you're doing has real physical consequences, except maybe sore thumbs. But for longer than video games have even existed, there's been another type of game machine in arcades, one which is just as reliant on physical props as imaginary logic, if not more so. The classic example of this is a pinball machine. While you don't literally reach into the machine to move your pinball around, the fact that there is a pinball banging around in there, hitting physical bumpers and flippers, subject to gravity and friction and entropy and all that jazz, makes it fundamentally different from a video game, which relies entirely on a computer's memory to show that you did anything by playing with it. While there may be a certain amount of computer-esque digital logic being used in them now for things like scoring, these games don't require computer technology to be playable, and many of them predate the emergence of modern computers by several decades. Skee-Ball, for instance, dates all the way back to 1908, when Nintendo was a mere 19 years old. So if they're not video games, what do we call them then? The easy answer would be just arcade games. But not only are there lots of video games that fit that description, there are also much simpler games to be found in the arcade, like air hockey, which have no automatically moving parts. This means, for instance, that air hockey doesn't have any built-in systems to keep you from picking up the puck and setting it down somewhere else. It's not an enclosed and mostly tamper-proof system, the way that both pinball and video games are. What both video games and air hockey are missing that pinball has is a set of physical mechanisms which determine how the game is played. In a video game, these restraints are based on programming rather than physics, while air hockey and other sport-like games don't have them at all. So a practical term to distinguish pinball and its ilk from the rest would be mechanical game. And if any of its mechanisms use electricity, we can call it an electro-mechanical game. If you know anything about the history of video games, you're probably aware that there have been many popular video pinball games over the years, which transform a mechanical game into a virtual experience. What might have escaped your notice, though, is that practically all early arcade video games have mechanical forerunners that offered substantially the same experience. Not just pinball, but also racing games, flying shoot-'em-ups and their ground-based equivalents, sports games, and even puzzle games. And the reason that you might not be aware of these games is that their video game successors were such good replacements for them that they basically wiped out all traces of their prior existence. Virtual pinball is cheaper to develop than the real thing, doesn't require any maintenance, and gives designers the freedom to create boards that would be impractical or even impossible to actually build. So naturally, assuming that you don't mind the unreality of it all, virtual pinball has made real pinball more or less irrelevant as far as most players are concerned. And the same is true for almost all other electromechanical games. Compared with video games, they come across as an inferior technology with little enduring value. The few pinball machines that survive today hang on as curiosities and nostalgic collectibles. Pinball is still ingrained in American gaming culture, in large part because it was popular for so long before its virtual substitute was invented. Other electromechanical games don't have that advantage, often having been created less than a decade before the video games that would supplant them. Those which do survive, like Skee-Ball and Whack-A-Mole, do so not because they have a long and storied history, but because their appeal is so simple and visceral that virtualization doesn't add anything to it. Almost every video game developer with roots that stretch back to the 1970s has had some experience making electromechanical games, and that's as true of American companies like Midway and Williams as it is of Japanese ones like Sega and Namco. In fact, you could argue that the model of branching out from mechanical games to video games was a kind of product that these American firms exported to Japan, in the same way that they exported their pinball machines and Pong cabinets. But once that transition was finished, there weren't many people among either the customers or the developers of video arcade games who looked back wistfully at the electromechanical games left behind. That's why information about these games is so scarce today. It also means that back in the early 1970s, any company that was planning a big push into the electromechanical game market, without the experience to prepare it for a seamless transition into video games later on, was setting itself up for a potential disaster. And that's exactly what Nintendo was about to do. While its rivals in the electromechanical game world were hedging their bets, making innovative mechanical games but also experimenting with simple video games at the same time, Nintendo would bet the farm, and almost lose it, in an attempt to dominate a market that was about to disappear. Only one other company would wait as long as Nintendo to start making its own video games, but even in this case, it wasn't because it couldn't develop them. Rather, it didn't have to, thanks to an exclusive publishing deal with the American video game giant Atari. This would turn out to be one of Nintendo's toughest rivals for years to come, the Nakamura Manufacturing Company of Tokyo, soon to be much better known as Namco. I've heard people refer to several decades, including the one we're currently in, as the Wild West era of gaming. But I think that label is best applied to the 1970s, when video games constituted a brand new market with a yet-to-be-defined cultural identity. And when it comes to Namco specifically, the term is even more apt, because its founder, Masaya Nakamura, was quite a cowboy by the standards of Japanese businessmen. For one thing, he knew a lot about guns, an unusual interest to have in a country where private ownership of firearms is generally frowned upon, if not actually illegal. He had a good reason, though. His father ran a store which repaired and sold hunting shotguns, one of the few legal varieties. A more profitable sideline of his family's business, and a less edgy one, was a harmless pop gun that could be used in shooting games, a common sight at Japanese summer festivals and other county fair-like events. But Nakamura would jumpstart his own career with an amusement based on the cowboy's other trusty companion, his horse. If there was one thing Nakamura knew, it was that kids love animals. And if there were two things he knew, it's that kids love animals, and they also hate waiting around while their moms shop in a department store all afternoon. So his first product idea was what we would now call a kiddie ride, a simple mechanical amusement that bounces around while a pint-sized customer perches on top, sort of like a carousel horse that stays in one place. Nakamura built 2 of these hand-cranked baby Broncos and installed them on the roof of a Matsuya department store in Yokohama, where they immediately attracted attention and became a modest hit with kids, providing the funding he needed to expand his business. Within a few years, Nakamura was being approached by Mitsukoshi, one of the largest department store chains in Japan, with requests for a whole mini amusement park to be located on the roof of their store in central Tokyo. He was happy to oblige, and the concept ended up being so successful that Mitsukoshi decided to roll it out to all its other branches. Although his business was called a manufacturing company, Nakamura only produced a handful of products in-house. He was more successful as an importer and wholesaler of other companies' machines at first, although he did expand his kiddie ride offerings with licensing deals, striking a bargain with who else but Disney in 1966 to have its animated characters appear on his rides. As I mentioned in the first video, the year before this, Nakamura Manufacturing had produced its first really innovative electromechanical game, Torpedo Launcher. But it was still a fairly small company at this point, and didn't have the facilities to mass-produce any of its machines. Instead, the game was licensed to Sega, which took most of the credit, and revenue, for making it an international hit. Nakamura's in-house projects up to this point would be better described as installations, tailored to a small number of customers, instead of being sold to all comers. All this would change in 1974, when the American video game pioneer Atari, facing financial problems caused by widespread piracy of its game Pong and some ill-advised business decisions, was forced to sell off its Japanese division to raise some quick cash. Major league importers Sega and Taito both turned Atari down, but Nakamura jumped at the deal, despite not technically being able to, afford it. With no other offers in sight, Atari head Nolan Bushnell agreed to let Nakamura pay half right away and the balance over the next 3 years. The transaction gave both companies exactly what they needed at the time. Atari got liquid capital, which it desperately needed to keep the original American division from total disintegration, and Nakamura got a stake in the global video game market, which it would eventually parlay into its own series of arcade hits. The relationship between Atari and Nakamura broke down in the late 1970s, shortly after Bushnell was booted out of Atari and went off to teach rats how to make pizza or something, but it lasted long enough to produce at least one global blockbuster, Breakout in 1976, the first game since Pong to be just as big a hit in Japan as it was in the US. Nakamura, actually, let's just call it Namco from now on. It changed its name officially the next year anyway. So Namco poured its breakout profits into bigger and better electromechanical games, like F1, a racing game that challenges you to run down a track while avoiding an opposing car. F1 looks an awful lot like a video game at first, but with graphics a lot more detailed than any of its contemporaries. It's able to do this because what you see isn't being drawn on the screen. It's a live feed of an actual toy car being held above a spinning wheel with the racetrack printed on it. Running into the enemy car causes an explosion, really just a colored overlay that temporarily covers up the light illuminating the course. But other than that, there's not much interactivity. What really sells the illusion here is the sheer speed with which the car seems to zoom over the track. F1 was a massive success in both Japan and the United States, the first that Namco was able to manufacture in quantity all by itself. The next year it would score again with the light gun game Shoot Away, and in 1978 it returned to its military roots with Submarine, a more complex and immersive take on torpedo launcher, which sees the player attacking other subs rather than battleships. By this time, Namco was also making its own video games, starting with GB in November of 1978. But what really marked the end of Namco's formative years was the 1979 release of the classic single-screen shooter Galaxian. All of Namco's previous games, whether Electro-Mechanical or Virtual, had leaned on gimmicks and a sense of novelty rather than a core of fun mechanics. GB was an awkward mix of Breakout and Pinball. F1 and Namco's other Electro-Mechanical games had no real win or fail state, instead offering the player a noisy, flashy show. Galaxian was something different, a high-stakes dogfight in space, featuring enemy ships that would swoop and dive-bomb you if you dawdled in taking them out. It was colorful, it was challenging, and despite its blocky graphics, it was more immersive through gameplay alone than anything which had come before. What it wasn't was original. Galaxian may have made the 70s kids who played it feel like they had been plugged right into a screening of Star Wars, but it wasn't the first game to be inspired by Star Wars. Also, it didn't make as much money as Star Wars. And if that seems like a flippant comparison to you, it's important to bear in mind that the game which beat Galaxian to the punch actually earned considerably more money than the original Star Wars, or any other entertainment property up to that point in history. This was Space Invaders, released in 1978 by Taito, a very unusual Japanese game company. I say unusual because, on the one hand, it didn't make any games for the first 2 decades of its existence, and on the other, for the first 6 years, it wasn't Japanese. If you asked most people to name a video game that owes its existence to the formation of the Soviet Union, most people, assuming they even understood what you were talking about, could only name one: Tetris, the quintessential puzzle game developed by Russian computer scientist Alexei Pajitnov. The NES version of Tetris in particular is very, very Russian. It features a rendering of St. Basil's Cathedral on the title screen. Musical choices range from the folk song Korobeiniki to the dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy from the Nutcracker. And one of the ending screens shows a Soviet Buran space shuttle lifting off in front of St. Basil's Cathedral. But in an odd way, the USSR is also what eventually led to Space Invaders, Arkanoid, and Bubble Bobble. Because all of these games were developed by Taito, and Taito wouldn't exist if not for the specter of international communism. Its founder, Michael Kogan, was born to a Ukrainian Jewish family in Odessa, but his parents fled to China when he was only an infant, expecting poor treatment from the new Soviet regime. Kogan grew up as part of a Russian expatriate community in Harbin, and later started a small retail business in Shanghai, which he named Taitong, using one character from a word which meant Jew, and a second which meant Eastern. Back in 1944, when it was founded, Taitong didn't sell games, or even anything game-like. Kogan's specialty was animal hair products, like floor mats and wigs. He might have branched out into fields related to this, like, paintbrushes. But the way things actually turned out, China would soon have its own communist revolution in 1949. Kogan wasn't any fonder of the dictatorship of the proletariat than his parents had been, so he didn't stick around, decamping for Japan, where he had already spent quite a bit of time in his youth. Once Kogan had settled down in Tokyo, he decided to enter a new business, and I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that the business he chose was making and selling vodka. There was a hole in the market, you see, since nobody in Japan knew how to make vodka, even though it was an essential component of many bar beverages. As a sideline, he also sold vending machines that would dispense bags of peanuts, a classic bar snack whose saltiness paired nicely with his Troika brand vodka. Over time, Taito, as it was now called, drifted out of the vodka market in the face of increased competition, and focused on importing and selling bar-related machines, particularly jukeboxes. By the early 1960s, it had become the exclusive distributor for the American jukebox manufacturer Seeburg, which you might recall from last video also developed several pioneering light gun amusements like Shoot the Bear. It's impossible to say what finally pushed Taito to branch out into game manufacturing, but the example of Seeburg and the increasing prominence of electronic amusements in Japanese bars probably factored heavily into the decision. Its early games, produced in the late 1960s, were almost all either prize-grabbing claw machines or simulations of Western sports like basketball, both of which would have gone big with adults in a bar setting. They also relied on fairly simple, well-understood technology. Some of Nintendo's late 60s toys were more high-tech. But this was about to change in 1968, when Taito hired a young electrical engineer named Tomohiro Nishikado, who would revolutionize Taito's design approach in the same way that Gunpei Yokoi had for Nintendo. Nishikado had been born in Osaka just before the end of World War II, but like many ambitious post-war kids, he moved to Tokyo to attend college, graduating with his degree in 1967. He planned to specialize in audio engineering and applied for a job with the hyper-competitive electronics company Sony, but lost out during the final round of interviews. Instead, he joined a smaller firm called Tact, but the position he was given never really challenged or interested him. After a year of trying, he finally jumped ship and had a new job all set up when he ran into a former coworker who told him something that changed his plans. This coworker, it turns out, had also quit working for Tact recently and had taken a job with Taito making game machines. He said that Taito was desperate for people with engineering skills, and that Nishikado could do himself a lot of good by applying for a job with them. Nishikado was skeptical, but he went in for an interview and was accepted practically on the spot, just as his friend had predicted. At first, what he discovered at Taito was hardly more inspiring than what he had left behind. His university training had introduced him to cutting-edge electronics concepts like transistorization and integrated circuitry, but the games he was being asked to develop were hardly more complicated than a pinball table. When he suggested incorporating transistors to add some oomph to the experience, his supervisors told him it would increase costs too much. So instead, Nishikado used simple electrical relays, devices that had existed for more than a century, to make a deceptively complex-feeling mechanical game called Sky Fighter, first released in 1971. In this game, airplanes would fly inside a plastic dome, and the player would try to shoot them down, with each direct hit triggering a simulated explosion. The graphics were displayed in the same way as Namco's F1, with the movement of physical objects below the field of view being reflected via mirrors to make it look like everything was happening in one place, right in front of the player. The effect was a bit shakier than F1, but then again, Skyfighter came out 5 years earlier, at a time when no one, especially Taito, would have been thought capable of such an impressive spectacle. The game was a big hit, and a major reason for Taito to give Nishikado more leeway to innovate in his subsequent games. But the more decisive reason was likely Atari's Pong, the first blockbuster video game in history, which burst onto the global game scene the next year and forced many entertainment companies to totally reconsider their business plans. While they may not have fully thought out the implications back in 1968, developments like this were exactly why Taito had hired Nishikado in the first place. He was their only employee who had experience with integrated circuits, which meant he could do something almost no one else had considered doing. Pry the back off a Pong console, study the circuit board, and figure out exactly how it worked, so his company could make the same thing. Nishikado took almost 6 months to figure it all out, but this was still faster than Atari's attempts to navigate Japan's forest of red tape and legally release the game there. In the end, Taito and Sega both independently reverse-engineered Pong and had knockoffs in the arcades before Atari's ill-fated Japanese branch could deliver the real thing. But Sega was slow to follow up on this success, coasting on sales of its Pongtron for the next year, while Taito and Nishikado steamed ahead to make more complicated Pong-likes that served as digital versions of its existing mechanical games. Before Sega could catch up, Taito had already released its takes on tennis, ice hockey, and soccer, and soon afterward it put out TV basketball. As with Pong, it can be hard to see the magic in this game these days, but TV basketball blew people away in 1974. This was the first video game in which your character looked anything like a real person. It's credited with being the first sprite ever. Mechanically, the game is almost identical to Pong, but the mere attempt at drawing a scene with graphics was a revelation. TV Basketball was the first Japanese video game to be licensed for release outside Japan, but from this point onward, practically all of the games that Nishikado made for Taito would be international hits. Speed Race and its many sequels, Western Gun, Interceptor, and most especially, Space Invaders. I don't need to tell you what Space Invaders was like, or how big a deal it was. That is some well-trodden ground, both on YouTube and everywhere else, and this video is going to be plenty long as it is. Besides, what really interests me about Space Invaders isn't the game itself, but what Taito did to follow it up. Which is to say, almost nothing. Oh, they made Space Invaders 2, or rather, Part 2, a year later, but this was a minor iteration on the original, which failed to capture even a fraction of its profits or cultural impact. Namco's Galaxian would release just a few months later in both Japan and the US, and completely steal Taito's thunder. It was caught napping in the same way that Taito itself had caught Sega napping years before, after the release of their Pong clones. And what must really have stung was that among the companies pushing ahead of it, as both a developer and a publisher, was Sega. If you've ever wondered why Sega seemed to have such an easy time connecting with American kids in the early 90s through its advertising, while other Japanese game companies like Nintendo struggled to look cool to the same demographic, a big part of that success is due to the fact that, at heart, Sega has always been something of an American company. The business that eventually became Sega was headquartered in the United States, and its target market was Americans who happened to be in Japan. It expanded by both acquiring and being acquired by American companies, and the executive who oversaw its final transformation into a fully Japanese organization was also an American. U.S. Air Force officer David Rosen was one of many servicemen who became enamored of Japan and its culture while being stationed there during the Korean War. Returning to Japan a few years after the war ended, he started an export business which sold Japanese art to American aficionados, and also operated a chain of photo booths. By the late 1950s, he was importing American coin-operated amusements, including Seeburg's Shoot the Bear, to entertain his customers. This put him in roughly the same line of business as fellow countrymen Irving Bromberg, Martin Bromley, and James Humpert, who had founded a company called Service Games of Japan in 1946, as one of a string of businesses that operated slot machines on U.S. military bases. By 1954, when Rosen started his company, some of their products were already labeled Sega, as an abbreviation of Service Games, but it would be a long time before that name extended over the whole company. Service Games had a problem. Well, actually it had lots of problems, mostly revolving around its uncertain legal status as an officially American company operating inside Japan. But its biggest problem was that its primary customer, the US government, didn't trust it, and was full of people who thought slot machines shouldn't even be allowed on military bases. Everybody knew that GIs liked to gamble, and it was argued that the slot machines kept that gambling off the streets, so to speak. But there were still many military officials who considered the practice immoral and contrary to proper discipline. Over the years, Service Games was accused of a lot of sleazy, borderline illegal, and even literally illegal behavior, including customs violations, bribery, extortion, and tax evasion. None of these charges stuck, but the accusation alone was enough to get the company banned from bases across the Far East. At the same time, Japan's government, which had never looked favorably on gambling, suspected that Service Games was diverting some of its machines to be sold in Japanese cities, where both their sale and operation was against the law. To avert all this hostile attention, the founders of Service Games allowed it to be dissolved, and reincorporated its capital under the names of two new companies, which now fell decisively under Japanese law. Sega Inc. would continue to manufacture, not sell, slot machines in Japan, while Utamatic Inc. would distribute and operate other coin-operated amusements which were less of a threat to the souls of decent, hard-working Japanese people. Utamatic developed a few of its own machines, including a popular crane game called Skill Digga, but it didn't really resemble modern Sega until 1965, when the existing Sega and Utamatic were merged with David Rosen's entertainment company to form a new entity simply called Sega Enterprises, with Rosen taking over as CEO. This is the company that made a hit out of Namco's Periscope, and under Rosen's management it began to make a whole line of electromechanical games, inspired by the American ones it had previously imported. More than any other company in this video, Sega had a flair with electromechanical games, both in terms of making them fun and making a buck off of them. In a market where most firms produced a dozen or so mechanical games before moving on to video games or something else, Sega put out more than 40 in the decade between 1966 and 1976. They saw particular success with gun games, which Rosen had originally bought from American manufacturer Midway. But Sega's own take on this genre was more creative. 1967's Rifleman, for instance, would print out a little card after the game was over, showing you where your shots had landed, while Gunfight from 1969 presented you with a desert diorama in which two gunman figures squared off like Rock'em Sock'em robots, with the loser flopping down in defeat only to spring back up seconds later. I might point out that this was years before Nintendo's Custom Gunman was released with a virtually identical gimmick. But Sega wasn't opposed to the idea of copying Nintendo's homework once in a while either. In 1972, it put out an arcade Love Tester, which admittedly looked more like the old penny arcade version than Nintendo's handheld futuristic interpretation, but it's still hard not to think that this was an attempt to ride the coattails of Nintendo's heavily promoted toy. A few years before this, Sega had been bought out by the massive entertainment conglomerate Gulf and Western, and thus was American, again. The olden Gulf and Devour would hold on to Sega through the entire 1970s, as it grew into a leading arcade game developer and publisher. In 1978, it absorbed the American company Gremlin, and together they created Head On, a game about traveling around a little maze and eating dots, which came out almost a year before Namco's Pac-Man. More famously, Sega and Gremlin teamed up in 1981 to publish the arcade classic Frogger, originally developed by an obscure Japanese company called Konami. David Rosen was still in charge of Sega in 1983 when corporate owner Gulf and Western sold off its manufacturing facilities and the rights to its existing arcade games to a rival manufacturer, Bally, best known for making pinball machines. Left with only the American and Japanese research divisions, the rump of Sega had no projects to turn to besides a new initiative to develop a home video game console. This ended up being fairly successful, but Rosen still decided that it was time for him to leave. Kind of. Actually, he just left his role at the old Sega division, headquartered in the US. But because Gulf and Western was selling off most of its non-core divisions at this point, that meant that Sega of Japan was up for grabs, and Rosen reached for it. Together with Japanese executive Hayao Nakayama, Rosen led a new group of investors to buy out the Sega assets and start a new company, headquartered in Japan under the name Sega Enterprises. Once more, Sega was independent, and Japanese. By the mid-1980s, two of the arcade aces who set the world on fire in the 70s had peaked and were beginning to decline in popularity. Namco would never manage to outdo the success of Pac-Man, and had to wait until the 1990s for a new generation of arcade games like Ridge Racer, Tekken, and Time Crisis to put it back in the limelight. Taito struggled even harder to stay relevant. Although it would continue to be a major publisher for several decades, it would only see a couple of hits after the 1-2 punch of Bubble Bobble and Arkanoid in 1986. These were 1994's Puzzle Bobble, or Bust a Move, and 1997's Densha de Go, a game which uses elaborate arcade controls to simulate operating a commuter train in Tokyo. But while its rivals were losing steam, Sega was really just getting started. The world of the late 80s was its oyster, in the video arcades and living rooms of Japan and America. It had pulled ahead of Namco, it had lapped Taito, and its only real rival in the race for glory was Nintendo. So let's get back to that, shall we? Nintendo came to the Electro-Mechanical party fairly late, all things considered. The first serious step it took in this direction didn't happen until 1973, when all three of its major rivals already had years of experience in the market, and Sega and Taito were already moving on to video games. Only Namco, secure in its partnership with Atari, felt free to keep focusing on electromechanical games during the mid-70s, and it started making video games around the same time as Nintendo. But the team at Nintendo had a few important advantages which made their shift to electromechanical games somewhat less of a crazy decision. While they had never made an arcade machine before, they had produced toys that used the same parts. Gun games all relied on the same photosensors as their Kosenju toys, and many of their tabletop games looked and played a lot like Taito and Sega's electrified offerings. Their 1972 game Wild Gunman, for instance, simulated a shootout between two cowboys across a desert landscape, similar to the one from Sega's earlier Gunfight, with metal balls and a firing spring replacing the electric game's photosensors and digitized scoring system. A less tangible benefit, but still a potentially crucial one, was that Nintendo had a stronger brand identity and was more associated with its products than Namco, Taito, or Sega. When kids played arcade games back then, they didn't crane their necks around the side of the cabinet to find out who made what. The game was the important thing, not who made it. And since every company made many different kinds of game, no one had an immediately identifiable personality that customers would recognize. As a toy maker, Nintendo reached customers in the privacy of their homes, where there were no glowing signs or other advertisements to detract from its own products. As long as it made sure to display its name a bit more prominently than the rest, Nintendo could leverage this goodwill to get that all-important first try out of kids who might be on the fence about dropping a quarter on a new game. Which makes it all the more bizarre that Nintendo's first foray into electromechanical games was done in such a way that this idea of standing out became completely irrelevant. Remember last video when I told you to remember about Japan's surplus of unwanted bowling alleys? Well, one person who was thinking hard about that problem in 1973 was Hiroshi Yamauchi, who decided that he could capitalize in this underutilized space to create what would basically be a Nintendo-owned, Nintendo-operated shooting alley. No partnerships, no sharing of profits, or risks. No, Nintendo was going to do this all by itself. To make it all work, Yamauchi hired Masayuki Uemura away from the Sharp Corporation and assigned him to the project along with Gunpei Yokoi and another recent hire who would go on to greater things, 23-year-old Genyo Takeda. And thus was born the Laser Clay Shooting System, the largest electromechanical gun game ever conceived by the mind of man. Working on roughly the same principle as the Kosenju light gun series, this featured an enormous foresty backdrop that covered the entire rear wall of a building. Projectors would display images of clay pigeons against the backdrop, and customers would fire their light guns at them, while a hidden computer kept track of how many hits each gun racked up. Theoretically, this concept would be just as easy to run as a bowling alley, and would have a similar appeal. In practice, both the supply and demand sides were shakier than Nintendo had thought. During the first demonstration, the scoring computer broke down, and Taito was forced to keep track of everyone's scores manually. And technical hiccups were the last thing this system needed, because it was expensive. Entirely apart from the cost of buying up old bowling alleys in heavily urbanized areas with high land prices, the equipment itself cost upwards of 4.5 million yen per unit, or adjusting for inflation, considerably more than $100,000 today. But at first, it looked like Nintendo's new business was paying off. The technical issues were worked out, and its pilot operations were filled to capacity, partly thanks to an ad campaign featuring film legend Sonny Chiba. Japan's busy citizenry seemed to love the idea, and it was well on its way to becoming a new trend, just like bowling had been. And then, the oil crisis happened. In October of 1973, a group of Middle Eastern countries belonging to OPEC, the cartel controlling global petroleum production, announced that it would slash production of oil and end all sales to any country that had supported Israel in the recent Yom Kippur War. The embargo provoked a severe recession in the United States and brought into the open many previously unaired social conflicts and fears about the future. In many ways, it defined the culture of the 1970s for Americans, but as bad as the oil crisis was here, it was much worse in Japan. You see, Japan was also on that list of countries that were being blacklisted for supporting Israel, and unlike the United States, Japan had almost no capacity to produce its own petroleum. Its economy was totally dependent on imported oil, partly for use in automobiles, but primarily as a source of power for industry. The much-vaunted economic miracle, which had made Japan the envy of its neighbors, was about to be throttled. A big reason why Japanese cars from the late 70s were so light and efficient was that they had to be, since there wasn't enough gasoline to power big, heavy cars. That shift had knock-on effects that are still happening today. It's why there's a Honda plant in the middle of Alabama. But the most important consequence of the oil crisis was that Japanese families didn't have tons of disposable income to throw around anymore, meaning that something as frivolous and expensive as the laser clay shooting system was doomed from the outset. Almost all of the orders Nintendo had received for the system were cancelled, but the company had already invested heavily in producing equipment and ended up more than 5 billion yen in the red. Nintendo has made some boneheaded decisions over the years, but this is probably the closest they ever came to going out of business. Luckily for Hiroshi Yamauchi, Nintendo's brand was even stronger with shareholders than it was with customers, and the obvious follow-up, a massive sell-off of company stock, never materialized. A new toy wasn't going to be enough to offset this loss. Having overinvested in electromechanical games, Nintendo needed to keep making them to survive, but with this one caveat, they had to be cheap. A stripped-down version of the laser clay machine, sized similarly to a traditional cabinet arcade game, helped with this a little, but what was really needed was an entirely new concept. As you might have guessed, it was Gunpei Yokoi who rode to Nintendo's rescue once again, with a simple but appealing idea for a game that would rely on a plain white screen and two 16mm film projectors, along with the now familiar light gun technology. In Wild Gunman, named after Nintendo's earlier mechanical toy, a brief film would play of an Old West cowboy drawing his gun and aiming for the player's heart. If you managed to shoot the bad man in time, the machine would activate a second projector and show a film of him collapsing to the dust. If you didn't, the original film would keep playing, with a caption informing you that you had lost. Each play of Wild Gunman featured 5 of these duels, and the really clever part was that all Nintendo needed to do to refresh the concept was to film new duel scenes with different characters and settings. 4 films were produced for the game, giving players the chance to take down as many as 20 tough hombres. Not quite up to the Billy the Kid standard, but still quite a respectable total. Like most of Gunpei Yokoi's creations, it wasn't flashy or cutting-edge from a mechanical perspective, but it was something that hadn't been tried before. Gun games for the previous half-century had been limited by the use of physical props as targets. By projecting a film and using the gun, not the target, to check whether the player had aimed correctly, Nintendo freed the genre from that limitation. This was effectively the first full-motion video game, released decades before the craze for them in the 1990s, which was fueled by the emergence of CD technology. Wild Gunman was Nintendo's first electromechanical game to turn a profit, and it was successful enough that 2 years later, Sega licensed it for release in the United States, where it also performed well. It was still more expensive to produce than most other arcade games, but not to the disastrous extent of the laser clay system, and the quick turnover of players meant that it could be a moneymaker even at standard arcade prices. Having proven once again that it could turn a familiar game concept on its head, Nintendo retreated for the next couple of years into more typical game designs. 1975's Smashmatic was built on the model of the original toy Wild Gunman, but with tennis rackets instead of gunfighters, and a pivoting arm with a ball on the end replacing the bullets. Skyhawk, the next year, used the same technology as Wild Gunman, but to replicate the older game concept of flying in a fighter jet and shooting down enemy planes. By the late 70s, it would be fair to say that Nintendo led the field in gun games specifically, but this achievement didn't mean much, coming as it did at the tail end of all Electro-Mechanical games' time in the sun. And no one knew it better than Nintendo, which had finally joined Namco and its other competitors in making proper video games. But the way it entered this market was quite different. Back in 1972, the American company Magnavox had contracted with Nintendo to manufacture a light gun peripheral for its home video game console, the Odyssey. In doing so, Magnavox brought Nintendo in on the ground floor of the brand new but rapidly growing home console market. Its electronic rifle would be the first home console peripheral ever made. A few years later, in 1974, Hiroshi Yamauchi broadened this business relationship by licensing the Odyssey itself for sale in Japan, and soon after he would develop plans for Nintendo to make its own home console along the same lines. Apart from playing cards, all of Nintendo's established product lines were suffering at this point from dwindling demand and increasing costs. Both traditional toys and arcade machines required large amounts of plastic to manufacture, and since most synthetic plastics are derived from petroleum, the oil crisis had led to skyrocketing input costs for Nintendo. Home electronics would be an ideal alternative. With these, most of the cost is in development, not construction, and the physical mechanisms subject to customer roughhousing would be minimized, limiting the need for costly repairs or replacement parts. The only problem was that apart from Masayuki Uemura, no one at Nintendo knew much about electronics, but that kind of thing had never stopped Hiroshi Yamauchi before. He simply reached out to electronics giant Mitsubishi, which lent its expertise to the project in return for a cut of the profits. First released in 1977, Nintendo's Color TV game was not a revolution in terms of how it played. All 6 of its original games were Pong clones with varying degrees of complexity, none of which was more complicated than Taito's 3-year-old TV basketball. What was revolutionary was the ability to play it at home, for the then quite modest price of 9,800 yen. That's about $200 today, and if that doesn't sound all that modest to you, don't forget that the Magnavox Odyssey sold for the equivalent of $700, and the NES, when it finally came out, was something around $450. The Color TV game doesn't get talked about much these days, probably because it's a bit of an inglorious starting point in video gaming for a company which has traditionally taken great pride in being unique and creative. Why would they flaunt the fact that their first home console was a Pong clone? That's not innovative. In fact, it was what all of its competitors were doing several years before. In making this series of videos, I found that it's more fun to talk about Nintendo's toys from the 60s than their arcade games from the 70s. And I think a big reason for that is that Nintendo's business model in the 60s is closer to how a lot of us wish things worked in the entertainment business. While Nintendo was making toys, the more innovative it was, the more successful it was. Back then, there hadn't been any unpleasant conflict between uniqueness and the bottom line. Now, in the 1970s, there was. Nintendo's mercurial, wild-card nature once expressed itself by imitating the style of competitors like Tomy, Takara, and Bandai, but by the mid-70s this had regressed into blatant copying. Atari's Pong became Nintendo's TV game. Sega's Duck Hunt became Kosenju Duck Hunt. Even Nintendo's first successful video arcade game, Space Fever, was nothing more than a transparent rip-off of Taito's Space Invaders. And what's really depressing is that Nintendo continued to release innovative products during this period. It's just that they didn't sell. The laser clay shooting system was a hugely ambitious idea, practically unprecedented, and it turned out to be a complete disaster. Smashmatic was a very clever electromechanical sports game that sank like a rock. Nintendo tried to put out a home version of its puzzle game Computer Othello, and nobody bought it. The sad truth is that in the 70s, Nintendo's customers wanted more Pong clones and single-screen shooters and light gun games, the same things they'd been playing with for years, because they already knew they were fun. Like it or not, as products, arcade games turned out to be less like toys or movies, and more like the slot machines and prize grabbers that they shared space with. Innovation was valued here only up to a point, and if someone happened to put out a massive hit like Space Invaders, they could just coast as kids kept feeding their quarters into it for years on end. It was a tough market to crack, and Nintendo spent 7 years trying to dig itself out of the financial hole that its attempts to crack it had generated. By 1980, Yamauchi was more than ready to move on. And luckily for him, Nintendo's R&D division was hard at work on a new project that would make that changeover seem almost effortless. It was called the Game & Watch, and it opened up, for the first time, a market that Nintendo would have all to itself.